My mother-in-law changed her will while lying in a hospital bed. Her daughter, my wife, never even bothered to call. Not once. My name is Lachlan, and until that Saturday afternoon, I finally saw my marriage for exactly what it was. Funny how fast a person can wake up. My truck was in the shop. My wife had a work dinner. And I was standing alone in my kitchen, reheating stale coffee when my phone rang. One call. That was all it took. 5 years of excuses. And suddenly everything had a name. My mother-in-law Jenna called me on a Saturday afternoon. She didn't call Marlo. She called me. I think, somewhere deep in the back of my mind, I already knew what that meant. But I wasn't ready to think about it yet, so I just answered. Her voice was careful. Jenna was always careful with her words. She was the kind of woman who thought about how she landed on people. She didn't want to be a burden. She had said that exact phrase to me so many times over the years that it had started to feel like a small tragedy every time I heard it. I don't want to make a fuss, she said, but she told me she had been having chest pain and numbness in her left arm. My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what that combination meant. Anyone does, and I also knew that Jenna knew, but she had waited. She had sat with that chest pain, probably for longer than she should have, talking herself out of calling because she didn't want to inconvenience anyone. That is the kind of woman she was. I told her I was coming. I told her not to move, and then I went to find my wife. My truck was in the shop. I had dropped it off the day before for repairs, which meant I needed Marlo's car. Looking back, I don't know why I expected it to be difficult. I think some part of me did expect it, because some part of me already knew who my wife was. But there's a difference between knowing something in the background of your mind and having it said out loud in front of you, like a fact. I found Marlo getting ready for a work dinner. She was at the mirror in our bedroom, focused, the way she got when something professional was happening. Her world had a kind of gravity to it. Her calendar, her career, her plans. And when you tried to interrupt that gravity, you could feel the resistance. I told her what Jenna had said. Chest pain, left arm numbness. I told her I needed the car. She didn't look away from the mirror. She said no. There was a time when I would have defended her automatically. Marlo was brilliant under pressure. Focused, ambitious. The kind of person who could hold an entire room together during a crisis at work without raising her voice once. I had spent years telling myself that the emotional distance came with the territory, that some people pour so much of themselves into surviving the world professionally that there isn't much left when they get home. She said she had a work dinner. She said she couldn't be late. She said, and I want you to hear this clearly, she said, my mom is probably just being dramatic. Her mom, her mother, who was sitting alone in her house with chest pain and numbness in her arm, and her daughter's response was that she was probably being dramatic. I stood there for a moment. I don't know how long. It might have been 5 seconds. It felt much longer. And then I walked out of the bedroom, picked up my phone, and called Andrew. Andrew is my neighbor, has been for years. He and my family go back further than I can clearly remember. The kind of person who was just always there at the edges of every important moment in my life. Steady as a fence post. He picked up on the second ring. I explained the situation. I didn't have to say much. Andrew is not the kind of person who needs a lot of words. In fact, half the time he could come across colder than he meant to. Practical to the point of bluntness sometimes. But when something actually mattered, he moved faster than anyone I knew. He said, I'm already grabbing my keys. That was it. No hesitation. No negotiation. No checking his calendar. Just, I'm already grabbing my keys. I stood in my driveway waiting for him, and I thought about the contrast between those two conversations. The first one in my own bedroom with my own wife, about her own mother. And this one, 20 seconds long, with my neighbor who owed us nothing. Andrew pulled up 4 minutes later. When we got to Jenna's house, she'd opened the door herself. She was upright and moving, which was both a relief and somehow heartbreaking, because of course she had been up. Of course she hadn't sat down. She had probably been straightening things, tidying, making sure the house looked decent before anyone arrived. She apologized when she saw us. She actually apologized for calling, for making a fuss, for pulling us away from our afternoon. I remember Andrew putting a hand on her shoulder and saying something like, "Jenna, don't you dare apologize." And the way he said it, firm and warm at the same time, I thought for a second she might cry. She didn't. Jenna was not a woman who cried easily, but I saw something move behind her eyes. There was something else I hadn't mentioned yet. Jenna had a quiet, deep fear of ambulances, the kind you carry in your body rather than your mind. Years ago, her husband had been taken away in one. He didn't come back. Ever since, the sight of an ambulance, the sound of one, the idea of riding in one alone, it all carried that loss inside it. That's why she had called me instead of 911. That's why she had sat with that chest pain longer than she should have, talking herself out of making a fuss. She hadn't wanted to be taken away the same way he was. I thought about that the whole drive to the hospital, and I didn't say a word about it. She asked where Marlo was. I told her Marlo had a work commitment she couldn't get out of. Jenna looked at me for a long moment. She didn't say anything right away. She just looked at me with that steady, clear gaze of hers. And I felt the way you feel when someone sees through a story you've been telling. Not with cruelty, just with recognition. She nodded slowly and said, "Of course." 2 words. The saddest 2 words in the English language when a mother says them about her own child. Andrew drove us to the hospital. Jenna sat in the back with me and she held my hand the way older women sometimes do. Not out of fear, just comfort, like she was trying to give me something. She kept saying she was probably fine, that it was probably nothing. It wasn't nothing. They took Jenna in quickly. The triage nurses don't mess around when a woman comes in describing chest pain and left arm numbness. They moved fast and efficiently, and within an hour she was in a room with wires attached and a doctor explaining what they were looking at. She had suffered a mild cardiac event. Mild. That word is supposed to make you feel better, and I suppose in some ways it does. She was stable, she was going to be okay. But hearing the word cardiac attached to someone you care about has a way of stripping everything else away. All the background noise of daily life just goes quiet, and what you're left with is the very basic, very human fact that this person matters to you. Jenna mattered to me. More than I had probably let myself consciously acknowledge, because somewhere along the way Jenna had quietly become one of the safest places in my life. After I lost my father, she was the only person who still checked on me the way a parent does. Not dramatically, not constantly, just steadily. She remembered things, noticed things, asked questions that made you feel like your life mattered to somebody. She also had this way of giving advice that never sounded like advice. Little observations about people, work, marriage, ambition, small nuggets of wisdom she would drop into ordinary conversations over tea at her kitchen table. Half the time I wouldn't even realize how much I'd carried those words with me until weeks later. And I think part of me had known for years that the warmth, steadiness, and understanding I kept trying to find inside my marriage was something I had quietly been finding instead in Jenna. I stayed. Andrew stayed for a while too. He went and got bad hospital coffee and sat with us for an hour before I told him he could go home. He argued about it, which was very Andrew. But eventually he left, and it was just me and Jenna. Hours passed. Marlo didn't call, she didn't text, she didn't message. There was nothing from her. Not a "how is she?" Not a "let me know what the doctors say," just a thumbs up emoji to acknowledge she'd received my several updates. Silence. And Jenna noticed. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just lay there in the hospital bed, looking at the ceiling, and I could see her thinking, processing. That careful, deliberate mind of hers, moving through something. Finally, she said, very quietly, "She's not coming, is she?" It wasn't really a question. I told her I didn't think so. Jenna nodded again. That same slow nod. And then she said something that I didn't expect. She said, "I've been waiting for a long time for something to finally make it clear." She talked for a while. Jenna wasn't usually someone who talked about hard things directly. She was polite, she was gracious. She had spent most of her adult life smoothing things over and giving people the benefit of the doubt. But lying in that hospital bed, with all the noise stripped away, something had loosened in her. She talked about Christmas 2 years ago, when she had been sick, a bad flu, running a fever, and Marlo had insisted on going to a friend's party because she had already committed. She had dropped off soup on the way and considered that sufficient. She talked about her hip surgery 3 years ago, the recovery period. How she had been alone in her house for days at a time because Marlo couldn't break her work routine. How I had been the one to check in. How I had been the one to pick up groceries and sit with her and make sure she was okay. She talked about her late husband's funeral. Marlo had been there, technically. She wore the right clothes, stood in the right places, said the right things to the right people. But before her own father's burial day was even fully over, she was checking her phone. Then came the explanation. A work call she couldn't miss, something important for the next morning. Some professional obligation that apparently could not survive a few hours without her. Jenna looked down at her hands when she said it. It was her father, she said quietly, almost like she still couldn't fully understand it herself. And I remember standing there watching my daughter leave early from her own father's funeral while I stayed behind greeting people alone. She swallowed hard. I think part of me knew then. I just didn't want to admit it. She said I didn't say anything. Because I remembered it too. I always made excuses for her, Jenna said. I told myself she was busy, that she was working hard, that she showed love differently. She paused. But you don't show love differently when your mother is in a hospital bed. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She was right, and she knew she was right. And she had known it for a long time. The hospital room was very quiet. The machines beeped softly. Somewhere down the hall, someone was being paged over an intercom. Jenna looked at me and said, "I want to call my lawyer." It wasn't immediate. There were more tests. More waiting, a long stretch of quiet where neither of us said much. By the time she made the call, it was late afternoon. Her lawyer arrived that evening. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because I think it's easy to hear this part of the story and misunderstand it. This was not revenge. What Jenna did in that hospital room was not the act of an angry woman lashing out. It was the act of a clear-eyed woman who had finally stopped giving her love and her legacy to someone who had never valued either. There is a difference. It matters. She asked me to stay in the room while she made the call. I asked her if she was sure. She said yes. Her lawyer, a man she had worked with for years, apparently, arrived at the hospital that evening. He brought the necessary documents. He was professional and efficient, and did not seem particularly surprised by the situation, which told me something about how often this kind of thing happened. Jenna revised her will completely. She left her house to me. Her investments, her valuables. The classic Mustang that had been sitting in her garage since her husband died. A car she loved the way some people love photographs, as a container for memory. She also left a significant donation to the animal shelter she had volunteered at for years. That part made me smile, in spite of everything. That was so completely Jenna. And Marlo, her only child, was removed entirely. Not reduced. Not given a smaller share. Removed. Entirely. The lawyer confirmed that Jenna had explicitly instructed him to notify Marlo of the change. When the lawyer left, Jenna and I sat quietly for a long time. I finally asked her if she was at peace with it. She thought about it, really thought about it, the way she did, and then she said, "Everything I've built should belong to someone who understands what building something together actually means." She looked at me steadily. "That's you, Lachlan? It's always been you." I drove home that night, in Andrew's car, because he had come back to get me without me even asking, and I thought about something the whole way. Andrew had answered the phone and said, "I'm already grabbing my keys." He had driven us to Jenna's house. He had driven us to the hospital. He had sat with us and gotten bad coffee and argued about leaving. Then hours later, he had come back to get me without needing to be called a second time. And Marlo, who shared a last name with Jenna, who had been loved by that woman for her entire life, had not called once. Not once. Somewhere during that drive, all the separate memories I'd spent years compartmentalizing started collapsing into the same pattern. It became about my marriage. About all the moments I had spent years explaining away because I didn't want to look too closely at what they added up to. I thought about the promotion I'd gotten 2 years earlier, one I'd worked toward for nearly 5 years. Marlo had congratulated me, kissed me on the cheek, and then spent most of that dinner answering emails because something at work was time-sensitive. I remember sitting across from her that night, realizing I felt lonelier celebrating with my wife than I would have felt eating alone. I thought about the time I got sick, really sick, and spent 3 days barely able to get out of bed while she moved through the house like a polite roommate, checking in just enough to say she had. Jenna was the one who showed up with soup and medicine after calling to hear my voice and immediately realizing something was wrong. And I thought about how many nights over the years I had started talking to Marlo about something that mattered to me: stress, grief, fear, exhaustion, only to watch her attention drift back to her laptop or her phone within minutes. Eventually, without even realizing it, I had stopped bringing important parts of myself to my own marriage. The last time I really tried, really opened my mouth and said something true, she was asleep before I finished the sentence. I lay there in the dark, and I remember thinking, I should feel something about this. But mostly, I just felt tired. That was the part that finally settled into place for me. Marlo wasn't incapable of showing up. She showed up beautifully for the things she believed mattered. The problem was that, somewhere along the way, I had stopped being one of those things. There's a kind of loyalty that announces itself. It makes speeches. It shows up at the right public moments when people are watching. And then there's the other kind. The kind that grabs its keys without thinking about it. The kind that sits in a hospital waiting room drinking terrible coffee because that's just what you do when someone you care about needs you. Andrew had shown me, without meaning to, without even knowing he was doing it, what real loyalty looked like. And for the first time in years, I stopped lying to myself about the fact that I wasn't receiving it at home. A few days after Jenna was discharged, I helped settle her back home. I stocked the fridge. I made sure her medications were organized. I fixed a light in the hallway that had been flickering for weeks. Small things. The kind of things that don't get noticed until they're done, and everything just feels steadier. Before I left, Jenna sat me down at her kitchen table. She made tea. She always made tea when she was about to say something important, and she looked at me for a long time before she spoke. "You've been showing up alone for a very long time," she said. I didn't say anything. "A marriage takes two people," she said. "And I've been watching you carry this one by yourself for years." I didn't say anything because it wasn't my place. "But Lachlan," she put her hand over mine, "you deserve to be truly loved. Not managed, not tolerated, truly loved. I want you to think, honestly think, about whether you have that." I drove home and I thought about it. I thought about it the whole way. I want to be fair to Marlo here, because I think fairness matters even when it's hard. She wasn't a monster. She wasn't cruel in obvious ways. She was just someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, that ambition was more reliable than people. That showing up professionally was more rewarding than showing up personally. Whether that was her fault or something that had shaped her long before I met her, I honestly don't know. What I know is that it wasn't enough, and it never had been. For a while after the hospital, Marlo tried. She came home earlier, put her phone away more often, asked questions, and actually listened to the answers. Once or twice, I even caught glimpses of the woman I think I had spent years hoping she could become, if life ever slowed down enough for her to let people matter properly. And that was the tragedy of it. Because by then, something inside me had already gone quiet. The hospital hadn't destroyed my marriage. It had simply made me see it clearly. A few days after the lawyer contacted her about the will, Marlo came home earlier than usual and sat at the kitchen table without turning on a single light. I remember walking in and seeing the letter sitting in front of her. She looked stunned. Not angry at first. Just stunned. "She removed me completely," she said quietly, almost like she still couldn't believe the words out loud. I didn't answer. Marlo looked down at the papers again. "She left you the Mustang," she said after a long silence. And for some reason, that was the detail that seemed to hurt her most. Not the money, not the house, the car. Because that car had belonged to her father. Jenna almost never let anyone touch it. She used to say it carried too much memory inside it. Marlo's voice cracked a little when she spoke again. "She thinks you were more her family than I was." It wasn't an accusation. That was what made it hard to hear. It sounded more like someone finally saying something they already knew deep down. I sat across from her, and for the first time in years, I stopped instinctively trying to protect her from the consequences of her own absence. That had been my role in our marriage for a very long time, smoothing things over, filling emotional gaps, translating disappointment into excuses that sounded easier to live with. She forgets things because she's stressed. She doesn't mean it that way. Work has just been difficult lately. I had spent years quietly carrying the emotional weight of two people while pretending that was normal, and once I finally saw it clearly, I couldn't unsee it. That realization changed something in me. Not into anger. Strangely, it was almost the opposite. I stopped chasing, stopped reaching first, stopped shrinking my own needs down into manageable little pieces so they wouldn't inconvenience anyone. And the strange thing was, the more I stopped compensating for the imbalance in our marriage, the more visible the imbalance became. The silences grew longer. The distance became harder to pretend wasn't there. It was like we had spent years balancing a table on one uneven leg, and the moment I stepped away from holding it steady, everything tilted into its natural position. One night, a few months later, we were sitting at the kitchen table when Marlo finally asked the question both of us had been circling for weeks. "Is there anything I can do to fix this?" I remember looking at her for a long time before answering. "I think if you'd asked me that years ago, the answer would have been yes," I said. "But I spent so long convincing myself not to need things from you that I don't know how to come back from that now." That was the first time I ever saw her cry without trying to hide it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. Like someone realizing too late that a door had been closing for years while they were too distracted to notice. The divorce itself was calm, No screaming, no courtroom war, no ugly public ending. Just paperwork, long silences, and the grief of two people realizing that love had not disappeared all at once. It had simply gone unfed for too long. Jenna passed away peacefully 3 years later. Before she died, she wrote Marlo a letter. Not an angry letter, not a cruel one, just an honest one. Part of it said, "I never needed perfection from you. I only needed to feel like I mattered to you when life became difficult. And for a very long time, I didn't." Marlo called me after reading it. She didn't talk much, mostly just cried quietly into the phone. And I remember realizing then that losing the inheritance had never really been the thing that broke her. It was finally realizing how long her mother had been grieving someone who was still alive. The strange thing is, life kept rewarding Marlo in all the ways it always had. Her career kept growing. She became successful, respected, important. But over the years, something else slowly happened too. People stopped coming to her first. Friends called less. Conversations with family became shorter, more surface level. Even at work, people admired her more than they confided in her. And I think, slowly, painfully, Marlo began to understand something her mother had understood much earlier. Competence can make people respect you. But it is presence, quiet, reliable, unglamorous presence, that makes people feel safe enough to need you. Nobody stopped loving Marlo. They just stopped depending on her emotionally. And by the time she finally understood the difference, most of the people closest to her had already learned how to live without expecting her to show up. If this story meant something to you, subscribe for more stories about relationships, family, loyalty, and the quiet moments that change people's lives.